In this podcast episode, former CIA operative Mike Baker provides an in-depth analysis of the ongoing conflict involving Iran, discussing the origins and complexities behind the recent military actions, the geopolitical implications, and the potential future outcomes. The conversation also touches on global terrorism threats, the economic impact of disruptions in the Strait of Hormuz, challenges in coalition building, the shifting dynamics between the U.S., its allies, and adversaries, as well as the overshadowed situation in Ukraine. Throughout, Baker offers insight into the motivations, limitations, and strategic calculations of the involved parties. Mike Baker traces the origins of the escalating tensions to decades of Iranian policy, highlighting the regime's consistent strategy over nearly 50 years. He discusses how Iran's refusal to negotiate in good faith on its nuclear program, the deliberate expansion of its missile capabilities, and the brutal suppression of internal protests contributed to the current crisis. Baker points out that Iran's negotiating stance, which only offered to reduce uranium enrichment from 60% to 20%, levels still far above peaceful civilian use, was a key stumbling block. He suggests that previous U.S. administrations had largely deferred direct confrontation, essentially kicking the can down the road, and that the current situation reflects accumulated frustrations with Tehran's steadfast position. The conversation explores the feasibility of regime change in Iran, with Baker emphasizing the low chance of success for any campaign relying solely on air operations. While he personally supports the idea of replacing the current regime with a government more focused on Iran's citizenry's well-being, he acknowledges the entrenched power structures within Iran, particularly the robust organizational synergy between the clerical authorities, political leaders, and the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, IRGC. The discussion highlights that while there was perhaps some underestimation of Iran's resilience, especially regarding control over critical choke points like the Strait of Hormuz, regime change via military force alone remains unlikely. The strategic significance of the Strait of Hormuz emerges as a central theme, with Baker explaining how Iran leverages this narrow maritime corridor as a geopolitical tool. Approximately 20% of the world's oil and a substantial portion of liquefied natural gas, LNG, and fertilizers transit this route. Baker details the severe global repercussions that disruptions here can have, including on energy prices, food production, and technology manufacturing, e.g., helium for microchip cooling. He notes that such disruptions mainly affect regions outside the U.S., given America's relative energy independence, intensifying economic pressures on Europe and Asia. The discussion underscores the difficulties in keeping the strait open and the high costs and risks associated with potential naval escort operations. Baker expresses astonishment at what appears to be a lack of comprehensive planning or anticipation of consequences surrounding recent operations. Despite the U.S. having superior intelligence capabilities and military planning resources, the closure of the Strait of Hormuz and its economic fallout caught many off guard. He points to the possibility that key decision-makers may have overestimated their ability to quickly topple the Iranian regime and overlooked the regime's preparedness and long-term planning. He also mentions that some in Washington might have been influenced by overconfidence, inspired by other geopolitical situations, such as the U.S.'s approach to Venezuela. The podcast delves into the intricate relationships between the U.S., Israel, Gulf states, China, Russia, and Iran. Baker notes that Israel's concerns largely focus on degrading Iran's missile and drone capabilities, seeing these as a more immediate threat than the nuclear program per se. Israel and the U.S. have somewhat diverging agendas, with Israel being more focused on military degradation, while the U.S. seems to pursue a broader strategy. The Gulf states, especially Saudi Arabia and the UAE, are cautiously supportive but wary of prolonged conflict. China emerges as a beneficiary of the turmoil by continuing to receive Iranian oil amidst sanctions and strategic disruptions. Russia's involvement, particularly in providing targeting data and advanced drone tactics to Iran, adds a complex layer to the conflict's international dimensions. Baker and the hosts reflect on the uncertain nature of Iran's nuclear ambitions. While Tehran's regime has publicly declared destruction of Israel as a goal, Baker and others stress that the motivation for nuclear weapons is more likely strategic deterrence and regional dominance rather than immediate use. The potential for nuclear weapons to increase regional instability is acknowledged, but the conversation also cautions against exaggerated claims that Iran would use nukes on day one, advocating a more nuanced understanding of geopolitical rationales. The discussion mentions intelligence ambiguities regarding the status and location of enriched uranium and the difficulty of halting progress short of full military invasion. The episode addresses the heightened risk of terrorism connected to the conflict, particularly from Iran-backed groups and lone actors. Baker emphasizes that while state-sponsored terror campaigns can be somewhat monitored and anticipated, the real challenge lies in unpredictable lone wolf or copycat attacks triggered by the heightened tensions. Recent incidents in the UK illustrate the tangible dangers of increased domestic radicalization and low-scale attacks designed to destabilize societies. The conversation also highlights how radicalization is fueled by social media, inflammatory preachers, and geopolitical grievances, complicating counterterrorism efforts. Baker discusses how the fallout from U.S. actions is straining its relationships with European allies. European countries, especially those heavily dependent on Middle Eastern energy, are facing severe economic consequences and political backlash. The podcast touches on the resentment in Europe toward the U.S. for unilateral actions perceived as disregarding allied interests and the risk of European nations seeking separate diplomatic engagements with Iran. Baker underscores the importance of coalition building and cooperation, lamenting the erosion of trust caused by dismissive rhetoric and insufficient consultation with allies. Political considerations dominate the U.S. response calculus, particularly with upcoming midterm elections and the volatility of public opinion. Although former President Trump's base initially showed strong support for military actions, Baker predicts that prolonged conflict will erode that support. The Biden administration, according to Baker, is motivated to find an exit strategy in part to mitigate domestic political fallout. The discussion conveys skepticism about long-term U.S. military engagement and suggests that the administration may be exploring back-channel negotiations to end hostilities and reduce leverage afforded to Iran by ongoing escalation. Towards the end, Baker remarks on how media and public attention have shifted away from the ongoing war in Ukraine due to the Iran crisis. Despite major developments underway with a potential spring offensive, the conflict is receiving diminished coverage. He highlights Ukraine's critical importance to global security and stability, warning that the reduced focus could undermine international support and complicate NATO and EU calculations. While not fully resolved, the podcast closes with a reflection on the prospects for an acceptable opposition leader to replace the current Iranian regime. Baker alludes to the fragmented nature of Iranian leadership, with the IRGC gaining greater control and reduced influence from traditional clerical or political figures. The difficulty in identifying a unifying and moderate opposition acceptable to the broader Iranian populace and various factions remains a significant obstacle to any meaningful political transition.